It's a Yukon podcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And Jeff, we are here today to discuss AI, Artificial Intelligence, a 2001 movie directed by Steven Spielberg. Jeff, this is a movie that I saw many, many years ago. I've rewatched it again so we can talk about it. I have a totally different appreciation and sense of this movie now. I think it's a fascinating polyglot text with millions of things going on. What's your experience being with this movie?
Very similar. I also saw it around the time that it first came out. The movie didn't make much of an impact on me at all when I first saw it. Rewatching it this time, I have a similar reaction to you. Much more interesting, a lot more going on, I think, in this movie than I had realized at the time. And I also remembered feeling like it was really slow and the pacing was off the first time I'd seen it. And I didn't feel like that at all this time.
It's not so at all. It's bonkers.
Yeah.
There's a million things going on in it. I mean, one of my notes is this is about 4 movies in one. There are so many ideas, so many genres are encapsulated in kind of different acts of the movie. So much stuff going on, so much to talk about. Jeff, I've drunk a load of coffee. I've got a lot to say, and I'm ready to vomit caffeine and insight all over you.
Okay, well, I'm not real happy about that necessarily, but let's talk about the movie.
So we have a three-act structure, if you like, to the way that we discuss popular culture texts. We discuss texts on the surface, by which we mean we talk about the plot of the text, and we're going to do that in just a second so everyone's oriented. You like to explain this as things the author wants us to know about the text. Yeah, exactly. We then move to a section that we call mythologies, which is largely to do with the societal meaning structures that audiences bring to the text. There's a big honking myth that lies in the background of AI, artificial intelligence, that we'll talk about in that second section. We then move to section 3, which is...
Well, we call it critique, but really what we're interested here in mostly is either received learned opinions about the text in question, or sometimes what we'll do is we'll try to make sense of what we think the text might be doing in terms of offering a large-scale understanding or criticism of social and cultural affairs. Sometimes we see these texts as occasionally they might offer an alternative vision of how to organize societies. And sometimes they're just sort of end up being thoroughgoing critiques, or we can imagine them as thoroughgoing critiques of the society in which the text is embedded.
Right, exactly. And critique is always the hardest level to explain, which is why I always stop talking at that point and turn it over to Jeff unexpectedly to explain what that section's about. So we will get to critique in a little while here. I want to start, as we always do, with on the surface, Jeff. What I thought we might do is just give a brief overview of the plot, at least enough to orient people or remind people as to what's going on in this movie. And then immediately after doing that, I thought we might talk about who is the author of this text? Because there's a sort of super fascinating and I think consequential question surrounding Spielberg's direction and the originator of the project, or where the project originated, which is with Stanley Kubrick. And so we'll get to that. Plot of this text. So AI, artificial intelligence. Incidentally, in 2001, apparently when you discussed AI, you had to put a period between the letters A and I, and you had to immediately define what the initials stood for, which just does give a kind of time capsule element to this text, because in 2025, AI and artificial intelligence are used totally interchangeably, and no one would be confused about what AI means or require that kind of explanation. But in 2001, apparently you did need that explanation. This is set in a future world, relatively near future world, I think. Do we actually ever find out what year this is?
We don't find out what year, and there are odd moments of discontinuous sort of story beats that occur here. On one hand, it appears to be extremely near future, maybe even just a couple of years into the future. On the other hand, we have the vehicles, right? The automobiles that people drive are very futuristic looking, very sort of time out of mind. They look to be far beyond and almost kind of kitschy in that sort of stereotypical sci-fi way.
Yeah.
And so there are these few elements here and there. And then there's also the reference to something called smart house, right? Which our the female protagonist refers to. And it's unclear what that is, but it seems to be some sort of interconnectivity that I suppose is maybe analogous to what we think of these days when we talk about smart devices. But what we do know is that the movie takes place somewhere in New Jersey. Manhattan will become an important part, and it takes place in a time in which we have had ecological catastrophe.
So it's a big climate change thing, which might be a clue as to when it's set, because I think of a submerged Manhattan as being not hundreds of years in the future. In these, I don't mean in reality necessarily. I mean in these kind of stories. This is usually like a late 21st century kind of trope. I think I've read other sci-fi. There's a novel called American War, which is about an American Civil War, in which the capital of the United States is in Columbus, because a lot of the coasts are flooded out, and that was like 2090 or something like that. So that's kind of the range I'm thinking of, 2070.
There are other elements that make it feel like it's very contemporary. The fashion that we see is, at least from the humans, right, is totally consistent with early 2000s.
Right.
And the architecture that we see, at least the human architecture, the same.
Yeah.
So there are not a lot of futuristic elements.
Yeah.
Even in a society that is supposed to have undergone ecological collapse, that has done things like dramatically reduce the human population.
But what there is that's a technological advancement is mecha.
Yes.
Which are embodied artificial intelligence, robots, and the story centers around a breakthrough, a new type of mecha, which is a robot that's going to be able to authentically love a person. And the breed of or the instantiation of that robot that becomes the story's protagonist is David, a human boy who is sort of experimentally given to a couple who have a child of their own, an organic child of their own, who unfortunately has a debilitating illness and is sort of cryogenically frozen and actually not expected to recover. And so this couple is offered David as essentially a substitute for the son. That's in a sequence of, I think, fairly stunning misogyny to help the mother get over her grief. The father seems mostly just kind of curious about the cause of the illness and the way the robot works.
Yes.
But the mother is stricken with grief. So the father, in absolutely classic 1950s, 60s husband style, speaks with another man about what can we do about my wife's feelings and sort of emotional collapse. And they have a male confab where they discuss this kind of solution to help the mother. And they go off separately to discuss the business transaction of getting David in the house while the mother's kind of crying, weeping, and all the rest of it.
And the big breakthrough with David is that David is designed as an AI, android who is capable of loving, of actually expressing love and feeling love, the love of a child for a parent.
Yeah.
Now, this is important, I think, because it immediately, if you're paying close attention, as one of one of Professor Hobby, who is the kind of architect of this new David AI, one of his technicians sort of immediately raises this question about, shouldn't it be the other way? Rather than creating an AI who can feel love as a child to a parent, shouldn't it be the other way, that we're trying to create AIs who human beings feel love for as though they were their child? So the love of a parent for a child rather than the love of a child for a parent. It's a subtle but exceedingly consequential difference, it seems to me, because creating something that loves as a child would love a parent is, of course, a deeply narcissistic and selfish imagination of what love is, right? It strikes me that the far more meaningful love is the opposite one, the unconditional love that the parent feels for the child, precisely because the child is the object of care.
Right, and the problem that's being set up here, and it's played out, it's at the core of the movie, is what happens if the child authentically loves the mother and the mother won't love the child back. And what you've actually set up there is, in the form of David the AI, a apparently authentically feeling entity that's extremely vulnerable, in a way a child is, that possesses an extremely basic, I don't mean basic as in to minimize it, I mean like elemental need, desire to be close to the mother figure, because their whole survival and emotional health depends upon this, and put them in a situation where they cannot receive the thing that they need, And this was when I said there was only one thing I remembered from this movie when I'd first watched it. This was the thing I remember, how absolutely devastating and heartbreaking the sequence of events is, where David is imprinted upon the mother. He's made to feel authentic love to the mother, and the mother decides that she cannot reciprocate. And figuratively, but actually also quite literally, tosses him away like a piece of trash.
Yeah. And does that after the organic child makes an unexpected sort of miraculous recovery and is reintegrated into the home. And then there are a series of conflicts that kicks off. Sibling rivalries, misunderstandings that result in, as you say, the mother, literally dropping off David in the forest and having him fend for himself.
Yeah, and that
abandoning him.
Right, and that sequence, if you kind of watch or pay attention to no other scene in the movie than this sequence, I would recommend, but I'm not sure if I do mean recommend. I would kind of point attention towards the sequence where David is abandoned in the forest, and the mother tries to explain to him that she's going to leave him. And perfectly reasonably as a child, he's like, well, just for a minute, like for how long? And when can, and she's like, no, I'm leaving you forever. And the realization that comes over the child's face,
right.
It's literally horrifying. It's honestly one of the most disturbing, emotionally disturbing things I think I've ever seen portrayed on screen.
And David's reaction is a purely, fully human one. He begs, he pleads with her not to go. He apologizes for all of the things that he's done wrong, which he wasn't really responsible for in the first place. They weren't, he's been kind of manipulated into, or they were misunderstandings or miscommunications. So it's a brutal scene.
Yeah.
And it's in many ways a brutal movie. And I think it's appropriate now for us to talk about the author's intentions.
Yeah, I think that's right, because if we go further into the plot, we're essentially removing the reason to watch the movie if you haven't seen it. But that's the kind of inciting first act sequence of events that then sets off a long quest for David to try and sort of regain his mother's, refind his mother physically, but regain her love.
To gain her love.
To gain her love, I'm sorry, yes. And to sort of find himself back in the bosom of the family. And that's kind of the structure of the rest of that movie, although it goes into crazy places that we'll explore a little later. But yes, I agree with you. Let's move to the question of the author's intentions. And the apostrophe is in an interesting place in the word authors here.
I think we're probably going to talk about this a lot.
Yeah.
So this is a Steven Spielberg movie. Right. And so it's released in 2001. Steven Spielberg then particularly is really riding high. Mm-hmm. This is at the height of Spielberg's sort of command of the industry. He pretty much everything that he releases just sort of turns to box office gold. And he's coming off, I think, is he coming off of Schindler's List here? I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
So Schindler's List is an enormous popular and critical success. And Saving Private Ryan is at the same rate. He's got this string of kind of movies that have elevated him truly into the upper register of Hollywood directors all time. And he comes out with this movie, and it's billed as a Steven Spielberg movie, but it's actually really not. I don't think it's much of a Spielberg movie at all. It's really a Stanley Kubrick movie. Right.
And so the backstory here is the story in its original form is a science fiction short story by the writer Brian Aldiss. Kubrick, as was I think his practice, would contact writers of stories that he found interesting and would either say, I've read this, I want to turn it into a film, or can we collaborate on? So this, of course, was the story with Arthur C. Clarke in 2001 and with many of Kubrick's films. And sometimes these collaborations would work out. Kubrick would never just take the short story and kind of literally shoot it on screen.
Correct.
But he'd change lots of bits around, or he'd work collaboratively with the writer. And sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't. So he contacts Aldiss, says, I like your work. I'm looking for a science fiction project. This is right after 2001. It comes out, do you have something? And Aldiss sends him a story called something like super toys are not just for summer, or super toys last all summer?
Last all summer. It's part of a trilogy of stories. And the first act, the entire first act of the movie AI, is pretty closely resembles that first of the Super Toys trilogy.
Right.
Short stories.
Okay, where there's an attempt to create a robot that will appear human, and the story is the relationship with the mother.
And Monica, Henry, David are all the
trilogy.
names.
So the mother, the father, and the mecha,
and the super toy Teddy.
Okay, and the super toy Teddy is always in there. And Teddy's very, very interesting. He is a super toy in the ambit of the movie, but of course that title is, you know, is David also a super toy? Is the clear illusion? Is David a toy or a boy? And how? What are your obligations to this toy? And Teddy is David's constant companion throughout the movie. But I saw him as fulfilling an aesthetic role similar to, you remember Jeff Sebastian in Blade Runner? And up in his apartment, he has those kind of toys that he builds. He's a genetic engineer, and he builds his own little companions, and they're kind of toys that matter. There's like a Napoleonic soldier and all the rest of it. And they're in that movie to show the contrast, the kind of range of artificiality and sophistication up to the organic human.
Well, Teddy is also the wise mentor figure in the hero's journey.
Well, just as Jeff Sebastian's toys are really, really suspicious of Pris and Roy Batty and Blade Runner and say this is really dangerous. I mean, I think there's a huge illusion there that's going on. And so Kubrick and Aldis start working together on this story. And Kubrick really wants to make this story. And of course, Kubrick is thinking this will be sort of a continuation of the project he'd begun in 2001 about, you know, about quote unquote man and technology and transcendence. And at what point are you playing God? And at what point do you become a different species? You know, that, and David would be kind of the HAL 9000 figure, I think would be the analog here. But Kubrick finds that although he's interested in the story, he can't quite get it right. And also apparently he doesn't want David to be played by a real boy.
Because what I read was that he did not believe that a child actor would be capable of convincingly portraying the range that's required to be a robot first, and then an embodied boy, but with still elements of the kind of naivete of a robot. It turns out, I think, that maybe the issue was that Kubrick didn't imagine that there was an actor like Haley Joel Osment who could do that, because he is kind of extraordinary in this role.
Yeah.
He was in The Sixth Sense.
And he didn't think that, so he didn't think you could get a real child actor, and he also didn't think you could just like special effect it because the technology wasn't there to do it. And I think that's very interesting, because what Haley Joel Osment does is he plays David, I mean, with obviously his innate talent that he has, which is spectacularly demonstrated in AI. And I think Sixth Sense is a really important analog, because AI, artificial intelligence, for its first act is basically a straight up horror movie. And that kind of, the thing Haley Joel Osment did in Sixth Sense of being obviously the winning child, but also being an extremely spooky and disconcerting presence, is precisely the register that he plays David in, especially for that crucial first act of AI, artificial intelligence. The other thing I think Kubrick didn't realize that maybe Spielberg did was that having a real child actor gets you around a lot of the problems of portraying simultaneously like its sophistication and naivete that Kubrick thought would hobble the attempt to do so. Because David is meant to be naive in some ways because he's a damn kid. Yeah. And in fact, that makes, it adds to the pathos and complexity of it, that you've got two sources of naivety, or two explanations for naivety or incongruous behavior. One is he's artificial, he's a mecha. The other is he's a child. And on one level, we're supposed to have, I don't know, almost indict him for the artificiality, or parts of some characters in the movie want to indict him for artificiality on the grounds of him being a mecha. On the other hand, you feel tremendous sympathy and empathy towards him for the naivety and lack of understanding of the child. And the movie really plays on those tensions, I think.
It really does. And I think, so what we know, what has been revealed about the production of AI is that it certainly seems like Kubrick was very far down the road of having scripted this movie, it sounds like he even having storyboarded sort of scene by scene. And he sort of, I think it's not entirely clear what changed, but he sort of decided after a great many years of development of this movie that it was just something he wasn't going to be able to do. And so he shifted in the early 1990s and mid 1990s to working on his final film, Eyes Wide Shut, and apparently gave the idea to Steven Spielberg.
Right.
And Spielberg, and I think that Spielberg deserves significant artistic credit for what he's accomplished here, because this is the sort of best homage to Stanley Kubrick that I could imagine. And it is, I think, pretty inconsonant with the rest of Spielberg's canon. It's a totally different aesthetic. It's much darker and far more cynical. And there are aesthetic and visual elements as well that sort of the horror elements, right? The disconcerting use of music, the framing of shots, the ways that he sort of cuts between scenes, but does it in a way that it sort of fades out and fades back in again. These are not Spielberg sort of conventions. These are Kubrick conventions. And I think Spielberg deserves a lot of credit for putting himself into the orbit of Stanley Kubrick, a project that Spielberg took on after Kubrick's death in 1999 and dedicated to Kubrick's memory. There, I think, we'll talk maybe a bit later about where we see Spielberg come in and Kubrick kind of fade out. But rewatching this again, the thing that struck me across the face, and this is with, another 25 years of sort of watching Stanley Kubrick movies and understanding more about what his aesthetic was, this strikes me as a through and through Stanley Kubrick movie. I think the story, the pacing, the characterizations, even a lot of the dialogue, frankly, strikes me as exactly the sort of movie that Kubrick would have made. I'm sure it would have been a little different, but it strikes me as the kind of, it's the movie that he left on the cutting room floor, and Spielberg came along and picked it up and put it out.
Yeah, I think what makes it super, super interesting is the clash, and I don't mean it negatively, but the clashing together of the two aesthetics of the directors or the people who are behind it, and that there's so much going on in this movie, and it's so. If you hate this movie, and there are people who hate it, I think it's a very, very divisive movie and always was. I think it's grown in critics' minds as years have gone by. I think the initial reaction was actually quite negative, and it's now seen as as actually quite an important movie. I would say it's sort of a fascinating movie. It's really stuffed with different ideas, different tones. And I think part of the reason that's happening is that there's at least two great minds almost dueling. And of course, when that happens, and here we can go into the cliches of the great collaborations, often in music, like Lennon, McCartney, Morrissey, Marr, all of these. When that happens, the two kind of, there's a strange alchemy, and the two sort of rein each other's worst instincts in and exploit each other's best instincts. And when AI is at its best, that's really what's going on. And the other analogy, this might not work for you or for anyone, but the thing that kept coming back to my mind when I thought of this movie was there's a Kanye West album called My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, which is a very long title of each word contradicts the next word. Yeah. Beautiful, dark, twisted fantasy. And that's how I think of this movie, like Spielberg's beautiful, dark, twisted fantasy. And the aesthetic of that album is it's like super overstuffed with ideas and samples and this grand sort of massive vision that's bursting out of the scenes. And I really think that's going on with this movie. I'm not sure how insightful that will be for anyone, but it was an image or a connection that kept coming back to my mind.
Yeah, I think the text is rich enough that it can support different kinds of interpretations. For me, like I said, I really don't detect a lot of Spielberg in this. Okay. So that's something that we'll talk about. Like even the parts that I initially thought were, okay, that's clearly Spielberg. In retrospect, it turns out that those were Kubrick plot points.
Yeah.
as well.
And we should say at this point that we got a lot of the backstory for this movie from an article you found that was really a sort of key that unlocked this movie for us, which is called "The Masterpiece That a Master Couldn't Get Right," which appeared in the New York Times in 1999, and we'll link to that in the show notes. But it's super revelatory on the history of this movie, some of which we've just gone through.
Yeah, and the article appears 2 years before the movie.
Yeah.
And before there was any sense that Spielberg was going to complete the film.
Yes, the article says this is Kubrick's long-lost masterpiece. And actually, I mean, I'll read you just the kind of the last sentence here of the article. AI might have been more than simply one of the most innovative special effects films ever made. Its focus on the small boy in jeopardy and the doomed nature of his most cherished relationship affects the emotions as strongly as Kubrick's obsession with transcendence engaged his intellect. And so they're saying it could have been Kubrick's greatest thing because it really would have combined the kind of emotions and intellect. And of course, the knock on Kubrick was always he could do the intellect, but the emotions were sort of missing, or the films were a bit chilly.
Yes, but as we'll talk about, that was, I think, by design.
Yes, no, I agree.
With Kubrick's vision of humanity.
Absolutely, 100%. All right, we need to take a quick break here, but we'll be right back with more on AI, artificial intelligence. And we are back with our discussion of Steven Spielberg's 2001 movie, AI, Artificial Intelligence. Just to finish off our kind of on the surface section, Jeff, one thing that we often do that's sometimes insightful is we talk about comparator movies, or, you know, what you might say intertextual reference. Sometimes an intertextual reference, a reference made in the text of interest to another text. Sometimes that can be explicit. Sometimes it's just fairly clear, but it's not actually, you know, explicitly stated. So what are some comparator movies here? I mean, I thought, I know you have a view on this, which is the comparator movies are largely from Kubrick's canon. I'll give you a chance to say this. I see AI, artificial intelligence, as having essentially four acts or four distinctive parts, each of which kind of matches up to a well-known other movie that I think actually Spielberg is fairly explicitly referencing, but at least it's in the background for me. And let me know what you make of this. I think the first act, or the first movement of the movie, David in the home with Monica and Henry, that strikes me as like The Omen. I mean, David is portrayed as almost like this is a horror movie for that first sort of 45 minutes to an hour. David's performance, or Haley Joel Osment's performance, and the way that David is shot and the music cues and everything, have him as almost this semi-demonic presence, and he's constantly startling people or doing creepy, incongruous things. And anyway, The Omen was the movie that came to mind for me.
Yeah. And there's also, I mean, when we're talking about a horror aesthetic that is linked to Stanley Kubrick, The Shining has to be a part of the conversation as well. Yes, they're very different characters, right? The Jack Nicholson character from The Shining and the David character from AI are very different, but they are both presented as sort of characters who find themselves out of place in an incongruous way with their surroundings, and that the surroundings seem to be causing them potentially to do things or to envision things or to imagine things that aren't so. And it's having a significant impact on the kind of the trajectory of the narrative in sort of classic horror ways. I mean, there's a certain way in which so most of that first act takes place in the home, in the household. And there's a way in which that the way that the household is shot, the different corridors, the surrounding kinds of areas, there is a kind of claustrophobic element, I think, to the home there that is consistent with the sorts of archaeological elements or architectural elements, I should say, from The Shining. Mazes, corridors, things that seem to be, physical spaces that are cloistered and tight and that don't open in obvious ways, and that create these sorts of weird moments in which, for example, as you note, David can appear from out of nowhere,
right,
or from seemingly out of nowhere, because there's a wall that is separate. A strange, the construction of the house is strange, right?
Yeah.
And we also get that at the end when we revisit the house. There are these kinds of tight claustrophobic elements that point to analogs in Kubrick's work as well.
Well, also, doesn't David sleep in like a blue blue egg. That reminded me of like Darth Vader's chamber.
And it's also, I mean, the other thing that's happening there, right, is that, and the mother has this realization, is that the half chamber, the antechamber that David sleeps in, is an analog to the sort of, health bubble that the actual child, that the organic child is sleeping in, which is itself seems to be kind of a throwback to the iron lung technology, kind of updated iron lung
Incubator or something for a sick baby.
Right.
Yeah. No, I agree. So then the second act, like David gets, the mother abandons David. David's out in the world. He goes to a kind of neo-noir city and meets Gigolo Joe, and then they get essentially hunted, by police, or I guess another analog would be, as it is in Blade Runner, kind of slave catchers.
Yes.
That's Blade Runner.
Yeah.
That whole aesthetic and everything that's going on there seems very Blade Runner-ish to me. Gigolo Joe is a very interesting character. Maybe we'll come back to him in Mythologies because there's a gendered element. But Gigolo Joe is Jude Law's character, who's a less advanced and more specialized mecha, designed to be a sort of a sex bot.
Sex bot.
Yeah, specifically targeted at women, which is interesting because sex bots are usually women and portrayed as explicitly targeted to men in these kind of AI narratives. So I thought the second act was clearly Blade Runner in aesthetics and parts of the story as well.
Yeah, and even the outfit that Gigolo Joe wears, right, is this long trench coat, sort of turned up collar.
And actually his appearance, right, that he doesn't appear fully human. He appears like a slightly, I don't know, what would you say, like his hair doesn't move. He's an ever so slightly, cartoonish or stylized.
There's something
human.
about, the face looks
very close.
Right, they've got the makeup on his face in a way that just points a little bit towards a kind of artificiality.
Yeah, right. In a way that Rutger Hauer and his kind of Teutonic magnificence almost pointed towards a Ubermensch element,
right.
Which is would be another Blade Runner analog. When they get to the Flesh Fair, which is just horrifying, just unbelievable, which is this sort of venue of cruelty where humans who have essentially adopted what might in other contexts, or if you wanted to make this analogy, be called a sort of anti-migrant sentiment. Maybe that's a too controversial thing to say, but very much like we are the pure blood humans, and we're going to completely exclude from our society these invaders that some have invited in as helpers, but now we've decided should not just be expelled, but actually expelled with maximum prejudice and cruelty, including summary execution, and not just execution at the Flesh Fair, but execution as sport, fired out of cannons through flesh shredding fans and so forth. That had an air of the surreal, but also the hyper-violent and cruel that reminded me of the Thunderdome from Mad Max, whatever it was, the Tina Turner one, Mad Max 3. Seemed like that was a clear analog. And then the final scene.
And the other thing, let's just Flesh Fair for just a minute. I mean, the other thing that's going on there is that it's in this portion of the movie where we begin to understand that there's actually a wide diversity of these mechas.
Right.
And most of them resemble much more the Ava character from Ex Machina than they do the David and Gigolo Joe character. Clearly robotic, right? And so they might have like a face that's sort of an organic face and some limbs, but with wide stretches of their bodies that are exposed for the gears and machinery that make them up. And the crowd loves the killing off of these sort of obviously robotic figures. But the crowd is much more upset, and in fact eventually turns right on the organizer of the Flesh Fair when it comes to the mechas who are so much more embodied, and in particular the David character, who pleads for his life, right, in a way that the audience says, well, mechas don't do that. They don't plead for their lives like that. And so they end up escaping the Flesh Fair, Gigolo Joe and David, mostly because their tech is so advanced that they more resemble humans.
Right. Although mechas don't plead for their life, but none of them are delighted a bit. No. They all run away. They all try to escape. And I think there's another Blade Runner thing going on here, which is already before David, the mecha have, if you like, evolved or been designed to value, to be individuals and to value their own experience, right?
They feel pain.
And to feel pain, right? They all know they're all trying to get away from the flesh fair. They all, they're a little bit more, they are more resigned to their fates than David. It's not that they don't plead for their life or they're happy to obey and be destroyed for sport. It's that once it becomes clear that they can't escape, they become resigned to their fate, which is another thing that happens to, earlier versions of the replicants in Blade Runner. And of course, the key point of evolution is the sheer ferocity and validity and genuineness with which Roy Batty pleads for his life, as compared to kind of earlier generations of Nexus androids, replicants, which is the key distinction in David. But David is the end of a line of evolution as well as in some senses a qualitative leap. And it's just horrifying. It's just a horrifying scene, very Mad Max Thunderdome. Last thing I wanted to talk about is a comparator movie. I think the fourth act, if that works, the fourth movement of the piece, which I take to be kind of the denouement where David is returned to his mother in a sort of artificially constructed simulacrum of his original home, and he's allowed to spend time with his mother, and he's being observed by superior beings while he undergoes this. This seemed to be a clear homage, if not just recapitulation, of the ending scene in 2001, where Dave Bowman is transported through the wormhole, and then the unseen aliens kind of reconstruct a sort of Baroque human house in which Dave Bowman spends an indeterminate amount of time seemingly growing old over many years, but also jump cutting between different phases of his life. Anyway, being observed and studied by these kind of curators of this sort of museum of humanity. And that's the same thing that's going on in the end of it.
And the other later throwback is a similar sort of dynamic takes place in Christopher Nolan's Interstellar.
Yeah.
When, the vagaries of time, space, gravity create this moment in which the Matthew McConaughey character sort of returns to an earlier moment in the household, this time from the perspective.
And so that was interesting. You said AI, artificial intelligence, was the most Kubrickian film you'd seen that wasn't by Kubrick.
Yeah.
I suppose, and I was thinking, like, can I think of any other contenders in it? That's a very specific task. One would be Interstellar. Is Interstellar? Nolan is clearly cribbing a lot from 2001 in Interstellar. Is that the most Kubrickian movie? Not by Kubrick. It's a viewer competition. Send your answers on this is a classic line. Send your answers to us on a $20 note, and
with no return address.
And we'll announce a winner on the next video. So, very good. Have we done what we need to in terms of on the surface?
Yes.
I think so. Okay, so after the briefest of interludes, we will be back with our section on mythologies. And we are back with our discussion of AI, artificial intelligence, and this now is our section on mythologies, in which we talk about the commonly held meaning structures that audiences will either need to or just will be inclined to bring to the text and are sort of necessary to understand it. The focus here, as you often say, is not on what the author wanted to say necessarily. It's what the audience is going to read out of what the author said, which may or may not have been the author's intention. I think in this sense that it's pretty clear that there are two things going on that we have to talk about in mythologies. One is the overarching structure of the tale as a fairy tale. So it's existing, at least in part, in that mythological realm. And more specifically, the fairy tale of Pinocchio.
Yeah. And the text is not coy about this at all. And so the Pinocchio myth, as the movie has it, is essentially revolves around the desire of David to be made real. Right, for an unreal boy to be made real, because as a real boy, he believes that he will, in fact, garner the true love of his mother, rather than the sort of the facsimile or bare facsimile that he has experienced up to this point. And so the movie is not coy. It's pretty heavy-handed about the Pinocchio myth. It plays a really important plot point, but it derives from the mother reading the Pinocchio story to him and the role of the blue fairy who grants Pinocchio's wish to be made a real boy. And so the quest becomes, after David has been abandoned, the quest becomes that he and Gigolo Joe go on. The quest becomes to find the blue fairy who can grant David's wish to be turned into a real boy. And so that Pinocchio myth is underlying the whole thing. And of course, the Pinocchio myth points to a very old human desire or dream that we have been talking about a lot over these last several pods, which is the investiture of human products with humanity. And we get that here. I mean, the Pinocchio myth, that's exactly that, right? Pinocchio is literally a human product who is invested with the capacity of humanity.
And it shows again that AI is merely the latest instantiation of this very human phenomena. Mm-hmm. It's not a different or unique episode in humanity's emotional, mythological, societal history.
Exactly, which means that the craze, the phenomenon of AI, the ubiquity of AI is at once about the advanced technology, but also about the much deeper and much more long-standing human desire to create products that then literally take lives of their own.
Right, exactly.
So, okay, so we've got the Pinocchio myth, and then encoded within that is the classic sort of hero's journey.
I did want to ask you this. Does David go on a hero's journey? You think he does?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
You know, this the whole second act of the movie, which is the part of the movie that I had completely forgotten about from 25 years ago.
So the hero's journey, we should say first, is Joseph Campbell's notion that there is a monomyth that underpins cross-culturally and cross-historically a lot of human storytelling, where a protagonist goes through a particular sequence of trials. It was brought to popular attention. Campbell's work was by Star Wars, and the degree to which George Lucas, either by hook or crook, by design or by just sort of falling into it, had constructed Luke Skywalker's story in a way that seemed to hit many of the beats of the hero's journey.
Exactly. And the thing that Campbell was at pains to point out to readers was that the reason that the hero's journey, in which we get a kind of a proto-hero who has experienced some loss or who is missing something, who then goes on a journey, a quest full of various tests and tribulations, and in order to find the thing that's missing and to bring it back, right, to make themselves whole. The reason that Campbell argued that it was such a monomyth, had such resonance across human culture, is that actually the hero's journey is an analog to the human maturation process.
Yeah.
The process of beginning as an immature child, going out into the world, learning or being faced with trials and tribulations that force one to become an other regarding person, to take someone else's desires, someone else's needs more seriously than your own, to put them in front of your own. That this, for Campbell, was the essential act of maturity. It was the hinge by which immature people become fully adult. And there, the obvious analog is the role of parenthood, right? This is what one does when one becomes a parent. That process of care is the hinge according to which one becomes mature. So for Campbell, it's not just that, George Lucas stumbled upon, Luke Skywalker as an exemplar of the hero's journey. It's that this is one of the oldest tropes in human storytelling, because it's an attempt to reconcile and make sense of how it is that human beings grow and develop over the course of their lives.
So essentially everyone goes on a hero's journey.
Or should.
Right.
Right. A successful hero's journey.
Yeah.
Right. Which not everybody, right, according to this line of thinking, not everybody would satisfy this, because here maturity is not simply a physical growth. It is an emotional reckoning with the need to put others in front of yourself sometimes. And this is not a process that everyone goes. Narcissists, for example, do not go through this process, right? So the hero's journey is at once a descriptor of sort of the ordinary processes of human development, but it also has an aspirational element to it, right? One has to achieve, right? One is tested, one sacrifices in order to reach this mature state of emotional adulthood.
Yeah.
And this is what David is going. Now, David's journey is literal, right? He is literally trying to become human, right? But it's that second act of AI has all of the telltale mythological elements of the hero's journey. We've got the companion, right, who is Jude Law's Gigolo Joe character. We have, in the form of Teddy, who's a really important character, we have the wise elder, who is, trying to give advice. It's frequently ignored by David, but that's also a characteristic of most heroes' journeys.
Yoda.
Yeah, the Yoda figure,
Or
Obi-Wan Kenobi figure. In Lord of the Rings, it would be the Gandalf figure.
Yeah.
Right?
Sort of like me to you as well in our relationship.
Something like that. So that's what's going on here, right? And of course, what does happen? I mean, David does make it to the Blue Fairy. Sort of against all odds, the Blue Fairy does exist. It exists at the bottom of Long Island Sound, I suppose.
Now, you did say, I wonder if there are any Spielberg elements in this movie.
But it turns out
that could be one.
Well,
no, you're right. The New York Times tell
what
that
we
that
know
was
is that this was Kubrick's idea as well, right? And it's the tragedy, right? Is that they make it, they find the Blue Fairy. The Blue Fairy is a statue who was a part of Coney Island, and the sort of what appears to be, I think, if you don't know the full story, the heartbreaking end of the story is that David and Teddy end up stuck under the ocean, or at the bottom of the ocean, staring at the Blue Angel, David pleading with the Blue Angel to turn him into a real boy for 2,000 years.
Right. Which is, again, I don't think we can stress enough. The movie on its surface, and maybe because it's Spielbergian origins, seems like it might be a kid's movie, and because it has a child protagonist. And I think it is really unusual to have a child protagonist in a movie that is just this horrifying, right? So what have you got? You've got people being fired out of cannons and eviscerated. You've got a child abandoned in the forest by a mother. You've got essentially a portrayal of hell, being pinned to the bottom of an ocean, staring at, pleading with something that not only will not, but cannot make your wishes come true. I mean,
and not understanding that.
Yeah, and having no way to escape. He can't even die down there. It's not like he suffocates down there, right? He is doomed to seemingly doomed to eternal existence in there. It's a really sort of horrifying thing. One maybe final point on the hero's journey I wanted to make is there's a meta element to this journey as well, in that David's we are given David's life in fairy tale form, but David himself almost becomes a fairy tale figure to the creatures that orchestrate the final act of the movie, which are variously read as maybe they're aliens, they're these entities 2,000 years in the future that rescue David and give him for one day his fantasy, which is time with his mother in a context where she loves him authentically as a real boy.
And the humans are dead.
Humans are all dead. Yes, exactly. What is it? We gas their
asses.
So the humans are all dead, and I'm sorry, you threw me because now I can't get the song out of my head. And some creatures sort of exhume David from under the ocean. I had read them to be sort of space aliens who were studying humanity from afar. This New York Times article raises what I think is the more interesting possibility, which was Kubrick's intention, which is these evolved AI from 2,000 years in the future. And to them, David is this crucial link with the human past, which they're fascinated by in the same way that we might be fascinated. I was going to say by like the ancient sort of Greeks or whatever.
Mummies.
Yeah. But also they could be fascinated by David as a link to the human past in the same way we might be fascinated by someone who said they were a link to God, to their creators, their ultimate, in the past creators. And they're sort of super taken with David and because his suffering and quest and journey was absolutely crucial to their later evolution. And he's this sort of almost Christ-like figure to them, that they're amazed to actually physically discover.
Right. Yeah, I think it's hard to know. I thought they were aliens.
Yeah.
Because they have all the sort of the stereotypical alien-like elements, Spielbergian elements. But if we consider them as robots, it's maybe, as you say, it's more interesting because it does throw back a little bit to what happens to Professor Hobby and that entire team at Cybernetics, I think that's what they're called.
Cyberneticists.
Like, remember, like, so they find, or David and Gigolo Joe end up there, but then David escapes from there, and we don't ever find out what happens. So it's plausible that they just continue on.
Engineering these...
Engineering, more and more advanced.
Yeah.
Until whenever it is that humanity is finally wiped out.
Right, and the AI continue to exist. No, I think that's true. In terms of a fairy tale, I do think that's interesting because we think of fairy tales as being like Spielbergian stories with happy endings that are not particularly horrifying that you can read to your child. And this is not that. That being said, many fairy tales, this is where I'm going with that, many fairy tales are actually only slightly under the surface extremely horrifying tales of absolutely awful things, of which this is.
That's right.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. Last thing I thought we might say on mythologies, because I think we've covered everything else, where we almost always talk about gender as a crucial societal meaning structure in popular cultural texts that have political or other meanings. I do think it's interesting that Jude Law's character, Gigolo Joe, a sex bot, is, I think, the only instantiation we could think of off the top of our heads, we'd love to hear in the comments if there are others, of a male sex bot, right? Yeah. A sex robot that's male in its outward appearance, and is targeted as, women who like men. Very, very interesting, because there are many, many examples of the opposite kind of configuration, and they're usually, absolutely stunning in physical appearance, and often quite sort of exaggeratedly quote unquote feminine in sort of appearance, and obviously very solicitous of male desire and want. And
we just had, viewers can go back just a few episodes previous, we just had a very recent example of this in the Megan Fox character from the
Subservience movie. Yep, which was very stereotypical in its portrayal of Megan Fox's kind of sexy nanny AI. Ex Machina we just discussed, which has several examples of this. And Gigolo Joe's an interesting character, but both because he has that gendered element, also because he, and I don't quite know how to say this or if it's accurate, largely because I'm not a woman who desires men, but his portrayal of male desirability is, he's not what men think women want, and all of these are stereotyped and cliched and overdrawn terms, like a big jacked up muscle man. He's like a slender, very pretty man whose sex appeal seems to lie in his flattery and his sort of verbal facility. Like, he's very good with words, he does little dances, and he knows what to say to make you feel good. Right.
And the other thing that's interesting about the dynamic between David and Gigolo Joe is that David is driving the bus on this. And
he's a more advanced mecha.
He's more advanced, but Joe has the better sense of what the actual relationship between humans and mechas are. In where he tells David, he said, she will never love you. Your mother will never love you. They cannot. They love us for how we make them feel.
Yeah.
Right. Which is an insight that he gets from being a sex bot, but he's clearly also correct.
Right.
When referencing the love to the extent that it exists for David. Yeah. David is a surrogate. He's a replacement. He's as if being, in Sherry Turkle's words, right? Close enough, right, to replace the son who certainly appears to be with a mortal.
Yeah, Joe has been designed to and has encountered humans in the realm of the transactional and the sort of physical exchanges of pleasure and so forth. And it's quite a sort of mechanical interaction. David is designed as a sort of all-purpose loving mecha who would have a much fuller range of interactions with humans that's ostensibly much more genuine and hopefully reciprocal.
And Joe, just to put the final capper on it, Joe knows that actually humans hate mechas.
Yeah.
Because, as he tells David, we will outlast them, and they know it.
Right. Okay, so we are, I think, finished with our section on mythologies, but we will be right back in just a second with our final section of critique. And we are back with the final section of our discussion of AI artificial intelligence. Jeff, we discuss critique in this section, by which we mean several things. One is we look at some of the kind of hidden depths of the text, try to see what is it getting at in a meta fashion. Is it doing something that is kind of upending existing understandings of stuff, ways to live, understandings of the human, could really be all sorts of things. We also talk in critique about the views of critics, some of the self-appointed intellectual leaders of our society who may have takes of varying degrees of heat and about the text, and we say whether we agree with them or more commonly why they're total idiots and we're really the only true intellectuals left in America. That about sums it up, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, good. So a couple of things we wanted to say in critique. First of all, I wanted to say what I quote really think is going on in this movie, or one of the key questions of the movie, if we regard it as an AI movie. I want to put that caveat. So when I say what's really going on in this movie, in its contribution to the genre of thinking about AI, the recurrent consideration, both actually in real world AI research and in fictional portrayals of how we should think about AI, how society responds to AI, is that this question about whether the human, here insert the word you're comfortable with, brain, mind, soul, essence, is on the one hand a mechanistic set of neurological, kind of logic gates where electrical impulses that are actually perfectly mappable and predictable and understandable are kind of passed from one neuron to another. In which case, we're just a series of kind of yes/no machines on a large scale that is entirely replicable in non-human or non-organic form, right? And some of the most basic understandings of what computers are and what AI is and will be is based on saying that's what a human brain is. And of course, therefore, all thoughts, feelings, and experiences can be what's called substrate independent of the biological substrate, and therefore replicable or recreatable in non-organic form. Or on the other hand, whether there is something ineffable, unmeasurable, uncapturable about, quote, real human thought, genuine human emotion, the human soul, the human force, the human spirit. And I think this movie gets at this because what it's trying to show, as many AI stories do, that they often take place when there's been a technological leap, right? You've now got the Nexus 6s, you've now got David the Mecha, you've now got HAL 9000, the most advanced new generation of supercomputer. And the leap that's often made is from the earlier generation of AI that are quite sort of mechanistic and behavioral towards this new generation of AI, at which point it is impossible to say they are AI anymore, or it's impossible to actually really understand what's going on in their brain. And they seem to have assumed, albeit via an artificial route, some of the ineffability of the human experience of life, or desire for life. In Blade Runner, it's empathy. In AI, it's love for the mother. In 2001, it's Hal's desire not to be turned off, and he's actually superseding his judgment for the human's judgment because he thinks the humans are wrong. And that's going on in this movie. I think that there's David is said to have a new type of brain, and what that's getting you is, they hope, the genuine love of a child for a mother, and that will open the door, they think, to AIs that dream, that have inner desires. And we're showing AIs in the movie AI at the start of the movie for demonstration. And they're very mechanistic creatures, and they have an understanding of love, but it's very much a physiological or literal response. Well, if you love someone, like your heart beats faster, or you do nice things for them, it's very behavioral based. And the breakthrough is David, who has this ineffable love for his mother. And the question always is that a, quote, real love, or is it just the result of programming? And at what point is there no difference between the two?
Yeah, and it boils down to, in a lot of ways, the difference between the predictability of the real and the surprising and unpredictable character of the fantastic. And what this movie, I think, is telling us is that what it means to be human is to exist in the realm of both, but particularly to exist in the realm of the unsurprising, as you say, ineffable, fantastic. The place where things don't make sense. And this is crucially happens to David, I think, which is why I think the fairy tale Pinocchio element is so important. He does not understand the difference between a fairy tale and the real. So when Gigolo Joe takes takes David to go see Dr. No, right? And they have to choose between the categories, right?
No,
Fact,
K-N-O-W.
you know, and there are like 7 different categories of experience that Dr. No can reference and provide answers towards. And they get nowhere when they are either asking about categories of fairy tales or fact. It's when Gigolo Joe realizes that what needs to happen is you need to combine the 2 categories, the fact and the fairy tale. That is when Dr. No provides the crucial answer. That is when Dr. No is able to combine the existence of the blue fairy, right, the real, sitting at the bottom of Coney Island in Manhattan, with the ineffability of and the fantasy of the fairy tale.
Yeah.
And this, the movie seems to be saying, is this is the characteristic element of human imagination and human capability.
Mm-hmm.
It's the combination, this hybrid character of living in the real and the fantastic at the same time. This is what AIs before, mechas before David are not capable of doing. And I think you're right. Professor Hobby, who designs David after his own lost son, seems to imagine love as the pathway towards the fantastic. And in that way, it does strike me as a different sort of, to the extent this is an AI movie, and I have reservations that this is really an AI movie. I think this is really a movie that's more about humanity.
But aren't they all that?
Human. They sort of are all that, but this one even more so, I think, because this is not a movie that fixates on the technicality of AI at all.
No.
Right? In the way that some of the other...
No, I mean, and to the extent that it doesn't make any sense. There's a scene where David eats the greenery to try and compete with the real child, Martin, and kind of screws himself up and sort of has a stroke. And then they open him up and they're literally fishing bits of lettuce out of his... Well, if he's not supposed to eat...
How did they...
I mean, why would that mouth literally... And, so there's a bit of technological squishiness there.
Yeah. So... I think to the extent that this is a movie about AI, that is a different vision, right? That it tells us what the real meaningful differences between the mechas and the orgas are. And it has less to do with biology and it has more to do with the realm of imagination, creativity, the fantastic.
Yeah, Gigolo Joe at one point says to David, only Augur, which is their names for real humans, Augur and Mecha, only Augur believe what cannot be seen or measured. It is that oddness that separates our species.
Mm-hmm.
And Gigolo Joe is, for all he's a kind of mono-purpose sex bot, as you said, he's extremely wise. Yeah. And he also undergoes his own sort of set of revelations. And he leads Dr. No, another artificial intelligence, to similar sets of revelations, largely led by David. And so David, in his own way, is sort of a Roy Batty revolutionary theorist or revolutionary figure, in that he is clearly causing changes even in the less advanced members of his species.
I think that's exactly right. One of there is, right, Gigolo Joe is a different character at the end, right, than he is when we first meet him.
Yeah.
And his final words, right, to David, I was, as he knows he's going off to his demise, right, points to that recognition of consciousness, right, and growth.
It's a very Tears in Rain moment. I've seen things, so it's kind of that analog, isn't it? You're right. The more we talk about this movie, the more I think it really is a sort of crucial and underrated text in this AI canon. I think the strongest critique you could level at it, and we are in the realm of critiques. And again, I'm working this out on the fly, and this is why these conversations are so useful to me, Jeff. I know they're painful for you. You listen to my nonsense, but actually, in much the same way as you're, as David leads Gigolo Joe to advanced evolution, you are doing this to me as we speak. I'm evolving. I think the strongest critique I could level at this movie at the end is it's so referential to other texts that it's at risk of becoming just an amalgam of other ideas.
Yeah, maybe, and that sort of points us to maybe the potential hybrid character of the authorship of the movie, which was a really big deal at the time the movie was released. This is what critics, as far as I can tell, mostly wanted to talk about.
Right.
And for a great many critics, they found the text wanting. They found it to be a bizarre combination of Spielberg and Kubrick. I think, you have a more nuanced view. You think there's maybe more Spielberg in this movie than I do. To me, this feels like a Stanley Kubrick movie. And if it's referential, I think, to his own movies, and there are likely some ideas that, as you have pointed out, right, point to other texts. But I think it's a coherent story, and
Yeah.
it doesn't strike me as a pastiche or a series of, of scenes that are meant to evoke other things, right? I think it may do that, but I think it presents itself as a coherent and full story within itself. And to the extent that there is we've been tracing here these last couple months, that there is a kind of storytelling tradition about human beings creating stuff that then take on lives of their own that are surprising or threatening. Usually in the text that we have encountered anyway, they take on lives that are threatening to humanity. Here, the AI are not threatening to humans at all. In fact, every human being, with the potential exception of the one technician at the very beginning of the movie who questions Professor Hobby's sort of ethics, every other human who's presented in this story is basically a horrible person.
Right.
And they treat the mechas horrendously.
Right.
And they're selfish, they're cruel, they're mean, they are exploitative. And the mechas are the heroes of the story without any question, right? And that is a little unusual for sure in this kind of storytelling tradition about human creations taking on lives of their own, which is, as we've talked about, is usually told in a dystopian and threatening register. Here, it's very different. And that is Kubrick, right? That is Kubrick's, maybe on one hand, his fascination with sort of the post-human that runs through a lot of his movies. But really, it's points to Kubrick's very cynical and disheartening take on humanity.
Yeah.
For example, he was quoted as saying in the 1970s or 1980s that he couldn't understand the fascination with technology threatening humanity because, in his mind, intelligent technology would be no worse than humans,
right,
and probably better because more intelligent.
Right. Yes. Let's take a specific quote from a specific critic that bears on this and see what we make of it. So it's Peter Bradshaw. There is a very good film critic in the Guardian, and he does have, and I can say this I think I can say this as a British person. I think he does have the snarkiness that's often associated with the Guardianista intellectual, particularly when writing. Well, I was going to say particularly when writing about culture, but then I was going to say and politics and sports and life and everything. There is a Guardian perspective on the world that is quite sort of ironically detached.
Too cool for school.
That also is a characteristically British intellectual position. But anyway, these are Peter Bradshaw. Hey, he has a YouTube channel. So good for you, Pete. We love your channel. Sorry about this. But here's Peter Bradshaw's original review of 2001 from the time the movie came out. Freudian slip in the Guardian. In theory, Kubrick should play the salty Lennon to Spielberg's Sucrose McCartney. Or to put it another way, Stanley provides the high-tech, high-concept, and Stephen gives it the big beating heart. But it turns out like George Bernard Shaw's joke to the beautiful young woman who wanted to breed with him. This may be a 2001 idea rather than a 2025 phrase. Mm-hmm. It turns out like George Bernard Shaw's joke to the beautiful young woman who wanted to breed with him. What if the baby gets my body and your brains? AI winds up with Kubrick's empathy and Spielberg's intellectual muscle. It's a lethal combination. Is that unfair?
Yeah, I don't really even understand what he's saying.
Well, he's saying...
I get the snarky kind of cynical hot take element of it, but I don't understand the substance of what he's getting at. What, for example, is Spielberg's intellectual muscle? And where does it appear exactly in this movie?
So I think what he's saying is you've got Kubrick, who's known for grand intellectual works of art, and you've got Spielberg, who's known for emotionally affecting blockbusters. Let's say 2001 versus E.T. in the realm of science fiction. And what you'd ideally want from a melding of the two would be something with a big beating emotional heart that has blockbuster appeal, but the intellectual heft and artistic significance of Kubrick. And he says, but in his view, what you get in the end in AI is the intellectual heft of ET and the emotional empathy of 2001, which is sort of a worst of both worlds situation.
Yeah, I get that, but again, I want to see where in the text. I mean, what are the examples from the text? I just don't see that.
Yeah.
Like,
so he did cite one where he said,
to the extent that this is a Kubrick movie, as I think we have talked about,
yeah,
or at least in large part, that David is Kubrick's character, and we are extremely empathetic to him.
Right.
We're extremely empathetic to Gigolo Joe.
Yeah.
Like I'm not sure the comparison to Lennon and McCartney is also hackneyed and easy, because John Lennon had a ton of open-hearted, big, good faith songs, and McCartney's got a ton of cynical, dour songs. So, too clever by half.
So how about this? What if is AI 2001: A Space Odyssey made for and about children? Does that work?
Maybe. How would it work?
Well, in the protagonists in 2001 are, I mean, A, not very important, but B, are sort of staid, middle-aged, bureaucratic men who are largely being acted upon by forces that are actually much more interesting, that you don't really understand, and are portrayed in impressionistic and elliptical ways, often unseen, and are open to a myriad of interpretations as to what's going on at every stage of the movie, but in particular in its final act. In AI, the protagonist is a child through whose eyes we see the story, and you're sort of led a little bit more by the hand as to what's literally happening in AI than you are in 2001. So to give you a scene comparison, the end of 2001, I alluded to this earlier, is Dave Bowman could be anywhere. The millions of interpretations, could be dead, could be, who knows what's happened to him. But literally what was shown on screen is him pottering about, seemingly disconnected from time, reappearing at different points in his own life in a literally impossible set of rooms that seem that perhaps, although again it's open to interpretation, have been created for him as a sort of incongruous set of things that are ripped from his mind to give him a context in which to exist by beings who are, kind of observing him. But all of that is interpretation. What you're actually given is a series of impossible images open to a myriad of interpretations. And rather crucially, you are not led by the hand at all as to what's happening. You're just shown a series of images and left to reconstruct in your own hands. The last movement of AI is you're given a voiceover literally telling you what's happening.
Yes.
And the aliens are not, if there are aliens who are orchestrating Dave Bowman's fate in 2001, you certainly never see them.
Yeah.
Well, you literally see, they're not little green men, they're kind of big, long, what are they, gray?
Kind of silvery.
Silvery aliens, but they're like, this is why we are interested in you, David, and now we are doing this, and then we are going. And so that would be maybe the comparison that I'm not sure Kubrick, I don't know if Kubrick would have done that in AI.
Yeah, those are good points. And there is something about that coda that is out of place in Kubrick's sort of filmography, or at least on the surface it's out of place, which was why, I was surprised to learn that he actually had envisioned that finish to the movie.
So that's a killer argument to saying that this is something Spielberg, an un-Kubrickian element Spielberg grafted on Kubrick's vision, is that New York Times article we talked about explicitly says, not only did Kubrick envision it that way, but he envisioned it that way against the objections of other people he was working with. He hired a storyteller, a writer to work with him called Sarah Maitland, who was not a science fiction person, but was a sort of mythologist or fairy taleologist. And Kubrick said, I want to end the movie with David just spending 24 hours with essentially his reincarnated mother and being accepted as a real boy and experiencing his mother's love, because the aliens reconstruct this scene for him, and then the mother can only be brought back for 24 hours, and then David is, who knows what David's fate is. On the final scene, Sarah Maitland said she hated this. She was furious with Kubrick for insisting on it. Quote, "It must have been a very strong visual thing for him," she says, "because he wasn't usually stupid about story." He hired me because I knew about fairy stories, but would not listen when I told him, you can have a failed quest, but you can't have an achieved quest and no reward. And Kubrick nonetheless insisted, no, this is the ending of the movie.
But I think for Kubrick, he sees that as, he doesn't see it as he sees it as a reward.
It's an achieved quest.
David has gotten what he wanted. And we know that David has no sense of time.
Yeah.
He has just sat for 2,000 years at the bottom of the ocean, and he doesn't forget anything. He looks exactly the same. Nothing changes, right? He doesn't have that sense of time that humanity has. And so what he desires is to experience the true love of his mother. He doesn't desire to experience it forever. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, I want it for all time. No, he wants to experience it, and he does.
Yeah, could be just for a moment.
Could be for a moment.
One perfect day.
It's a perfect day, which, for David is maybe the same thing as a perfect eternity.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Although from a human standpoint, or from the viewer's standpoint, and this is, I think we'll probably end with this, when I return to the point that this concerns some of the saddest, most disturbing scenes in contemporary cinema, or certainly that I've seen. That notion of his mother being brought back and then dying after a day and leaving David once again eternally alone, or to an uncertain fate, it is just so full of, it's just a devastating
And the other thing that's brutal about that is that it's not actually his mother who's been brought back.
Yeah, it's a simulation.
It's a simulation of her, but it's a projection of his desire for her, because we know how she actually was. She did not love him. She abandoned him in the middle of the forest. This could not have happened. This is a literally impossible desire for David. And so the only reason that it can happen is because the aliens or advanced robots or whatever reconstruct his memories. In his memories, he has just sort of forgotten or worked out of existence the horrible moments and the actual character.
Yeah, it's
of his relationship with the mother.
The purity of his soul, kind of washing the dirtiness of her soul and humanity's behavior kind of out of the picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have completed our discussion of AI, artificial intelligence, a mere 90 minutes or so later. Thank you for watching. If you like this kind of thing, please do like the video and subscribe. And on that bombshell,